Senior Biotech Analyst here at RBC Capital Markets, and thanks for joining us for this afternoon's sessions at our healthcare conference. Our next featured company is BioCryst Pharmaceuticals, and we're really glad to have many members of the senior management team here with us in what's been a very exciting and eventful time for the company. John Stonehouse, their CEO, Anthony Doyle, their CFO, Charlie Geyer, their Chief Commercial Officer, Bill Sheridan, their Chief Medical Officer, Megan Snizinski, their Chief Business Officer, Helen Thackeray, their Chief R&D Officer, and John Bluth, Head of Investor Relations. So team, thank you guys so much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having us, Brian.
Great. Well, maybe just kicking off on the most recent commercial progress with ORLADEYO. You've had a strong launch of the drug out of the gate in the first full quarter. Can you talk about some of the trends that you're seeing on the ground and what gives you comfort that the strong trajectory is going to be sustainable?
Yeah, let me start, Charlie, and then I'll pass it to you. We're going to be making some forward-looking statements, all of us are, and I just point you to our website for the risk factors associated with those. So to answer your question specifically, we're just getting started, Brian. And, it's COVID. Access, has had its challenges, although our team has done a spectacular job of getting to physicians. But, and most of the reimbursement thus far has been medical exception. So, we expect that this trend will continue and we'll fill the funnel even further. With each week, we're getting, more and more patients on drug. And with each week, we're getting more people reimbursed. And so all the signals are that, this is definitely sustainable. But Charlie, you may want to add a little bit more color.
Sure. Yeah. Hey, Brian. So I think there are two trends to add to what John said that give us great confidence. Number one is that patients are switching. So this is what we expected from our market research and our clinical trials, but it's happening in the marketplace. So patients first starting ORLADEYO in the first quarter, more than half of them are switching from injectable prophy. The others are coming from acute only. So we're really pleased about that. And then the other thing is our prescriber base is expanding very consistently. And even amongst top HAE treaters who have not yet had the opportunity to prescribe, which frankly at this point is the majority, the intent to prescribe in the future is really high. And so in addition to what John said about improving market access, all of this bodes nicely for the future.
That's great. And then maybe expanding on your comments with respect to access and reimbursement, how quickly would you expect ORLADEYO to move beyond medical exceptions to get onto formularies with established coverage policies? What's the process like there?
It's going well. Payers are responding very favorably to ORLADEYO and the demand that they see from patients. By mid-year, we expect the great majority of patients to have access for ORLADEYO coverage through their PBM or payer policy. So we're pleased with how that's going, and we think once we have even broader access, that's going to give more customers the confidence to prescribe and try ORLADEYO.
And this is Brian, I'd add that this is part of our strategy, right? It's filling the funnel with as many patients as we can. And that then drives the medical exception, which is a burden on the payer and draws them to the table. So, I think it makes this result of the $10.9 million in net revenue even more remarkable, given that the majority of it was medical exception.
Got it. And how should we expect gross to net trends to evolve over the course of the year, especially as reimbursement access becomes smoother?
Anthony, you want to take that?
Yeah. So, a lot of our focus, Brian, has been getting drug to patients who want it. And so right now, a lot of free product through our Quick Start product is going out. So at the moment, it's higher than it will ever be. What we'll see is over the course of time, as the launch matures, so later in the year, second half of the year, it'll normalize around, 15 to 20%, so in line with other rare disease products.
Got it. And you talked a little bit about this, the switching patients. Can you expand more on the types of patients you're seeing start on ORLADEYO since the launch, and maybe how this has changed as the months have gone on. I'm curious about their levels of disease severity, the types of drugs that they're switching off of. What are some of the trends you've seen, and have there been any surprises?
Charlie, let me start, and then I'll pass it to you for more specifics. But we're not surprised by it. I think maybe some people on Wall Street are, but we certainly weren't. We said this was a switching market from the get-go, and that's exactly what we're seeing in the real world, is that patients that are satisfied with their injectable therapy want a lower burden of their therapy by taking a once-a-day oral. So we're really excited to see what we saw in our market research and in the clinical trials play out in the marketplace. Charlie, you want to add anything?
Yeah, sure. You know, Brian, as I said, more than half the patients in Q1 were switching from those injectable prophy products, and so that's all of them, and it really in proportion to what you would expect from their market share. So Takhzyro is the most common switcher, then Haegarda and Cinryze, pretty much in that order. And then there are more patients switching from acute only now that they can go to a prophy with just one pill once a day. That's helping us expand the prophylaxis market.
The other thing I'd say, Brian, is they don't look at the market as, mild, moderate, severe. If you're having an attack, you're having an attack, right? And doesn't matter, what location, it's a problem. And so this idea of having one capsule once a day to prevent attacks is huge. And that's why we're getting the switching from injectable prophy, and we're expanding the prophy business and getting acute patients to switch as well.
Got it. What are your expectations for long-term persistence on the drug based on what you're observing now? I know it's somewhat early days to gauge that, but are there any metrics that you're using short of longer-term longitudinal data, things like refill rates, NRX, TRX ratios, to gauge what compliance and persistence look like, at least in this early phase of the launch?
Yeah, I'll start with what we expect, and Charlie, you may want to get into the specifics of the fact that we got a sole source specialty pharmacy, the info we have, and also the work we do to set expectations and monitor patients on therapy. But Brian, in our clinical trials, we saw 75% of patients in Apex 2 stay on through 48 weeks, and so our expectation is that a lot of people do really well on our drug. And so far in the marketplace, we've seen a similar retention rate. So far, so good. Charlie?
Yeah, and John, what is you talk about setting the expectations. Some patients do. It's not most patients, but some patients do experience GI side effects. They tend to be mild. They tend to go away early in treatment, and so we set those expectations. Our sales team sets that expectation with the doctors, so that's passed on to patients at the point of prescription. And then our specialty pharmacy team, the care coordinators and the pharmacists there, set those expectations with patients that this is normal and it tends to go away. And we think that's really helping drive long-term persistence. And then we get terrific data from our sole source specialty pharmacy. So it's something that we watch closely. The early returns on this are positive, both in terms of persistence and compliance.
Got it. And you talked about the real-world safety experience a little bit. What's the real-world efficacy experience like? Anecdotally, I know now you're sort of at a point where many of the patients on agents like Takhzyro will have sort of be fully washed out of any effects of their the previous drug that they were on. So it's really a good, litmus test for how well patients will probably do over the long run on ORLADEYO. I guess, what are you seeing? What are you hearing anecdotally? I know, real world experience can sometimes be different from clinical trials. And are there any, I'm also curious if there's any types of patients who you're hearing are responding, better in the real world than others.
Yeah, we were told by patients and the physicians who treat HAE that these drugs typically do way better in the real world than they do in clinical trials, that clinical trials aren't a good reflection of the benefit of the drug. And So, you know, one of the things we saw in the clinical trials was this really high retention rate. People aren't going to stay on the drug if it's not working for them, right? And so we're seeing the same thing in the marketplace, that, you know, people are going on, staying on. And so, and remember, stress is a trigger in this disease. So it's not only low levels of C1 inhibitor, but it's also, you know, the triggers. And if you're taking a capsule a day versus thinking about, oh, I've got to infuse, or I've got to inject, or I had an attack and I got to treat it, that's stressful. And so that may be a contributor as well.
Got it. There's clearly a large opportunity as well amongst undiagnosed, or even, you know, diagnosed but untreated HAE patients in the U.S. Can you talk about how important this is for long-term growth, and maybe the types of educational efforts you're pursuing around this?
Yeah, that's not the data we see, Brian. In fact,
okay.
the market research that Charlie did a couple of years ago said this is a very mature market. You know, 7,500 patients diagnosed and treated. The HAE Association says the same thing, and I'd guess our competitors would say the same thing. So it's a very mature market. So this is not find the patients. Japan is a different story. That's a find the patient market. So here it's all about switches. And, you know, and again, I think some people in the investor community didn't believe that we had the efficacy to get people to switch, and an oral wasn't enough. But that's what we saw in the market research. That's what we saw in the clinical trials, and now we're seeing it in the marketplace. And so it's a switch market.
Okay, that's really helpful. What about the European market? What do you need to do to establish this market, which has been historically, you know, less prophylaxis oriented, and what kind of, I guess, initial signals of uptake should we look for there?
Yeah, Charlie, I'll start, and then you can get into some of the specifics answering Brian's question. But I mean, first off, it's pretty amazing that a company our size, you know, filed in major territories around the world, and in a matter of 6 months got 4 approvals, right? I mean, that in itself is pretty remarkable. And our goal, that's part of our strategy, right? Take the data we have and go country by country around the globe and continue to get approvals, because our belief is, you know, every country that can contribute $5–10 million is going to add to that goal that we have of $500 million plus global peak sales. So Europe's an important piece of it. It's an efficient way to get into the market, and I'll let Charlie talk about the differences in that market and also our approach.
Yeah, and so Brian, we're taking a similar approach as to the U.S. in that we brought on really experienced commercial teams who really know how to launch drugs and have a real passion for rare disease. And so the first launch you can expect is Germany this quarter. And you know, I think that historical, what we're hearing from physicians and patients is the historical limitation in prophy was really due to lack of available options. That started to change with the launch of Takhzyro a couple of years ago. And what the HAE specialists tell us is that they anticipate increasing prophy to over, you know, up to and over 60% of their patients in the future. And so starting with Germany, well, you know, that's a change that we're going to drive. We have early access programs in France and the UK. And as John said, we look forward to going all around Europe, and we think that we have some great opportunities there.
That's great. What kind of pricing power might you expect in Europe?
So we'll announce our German price when we launch. I think what I can give you as just kind of a framework right now, look at the Takhzyro price in the US, the WAC is about $590,000. And in Germany, their final price is around $360,000 US. And so that at least gives you a framework. And then as we launch, we'll announce our prices in the different markets.
Got it. Great. Maybe shifting gears to the pipeline and 9930, you outlined 2 pivotal studies you'll be starting in the back half of this year. Can you talk a little bit more about their designs and how they were shaped by the emerging proof of concept data that you're seeing out of that program?
Helen, you want to take that one?
Sure. So our goal is to achieve a broad label as an oral monotherapy for all patients in PNH. Our phase 1 data, it suggests we'll be successful at that. We're moving directly from phase 1 to pivotal trials based on that data. and the program's moving very quickly. In terms of the designs, we've agreed with the FDA on the basic design and the primary endpoints. The endpoint will be changed from baseline in hemoglobin for both trials. We'll have two trials, one in patients who are not on C5 inhibitors and one who are on C5 inhibitors and are having a poor response. And that it will be oral monotherapy in both trials. We know the dose, which is 500 milligrams. And so as we proceed into initiating those trials, we'll give more details on the protocols.
Got it. For the study in the C5 inadequate responders, I guess what have you learned from your ongoing work, the mechanism studies maybe others have done, and the disease pathophysiology to shape your confidence there, where I know there isn't direct proof of concept yet?
So we have in our phase 1 data, it's given us tremendous confidence, as I said, and the data shows outstanding control for monotherapy. And so that control is for primary oral monotherapy, and it is control for hemoglobin and increasing hemoglobin, and it's control of the need for transfusions. So with that, we have all the data we need to move to pivotal trials, and the FDA agrees with that. There's no difference in disease state for patients regardless of their therapy, whether they're on C5 inhibitors or they're not. Their disease state is the same. And so proximal inhibition is an appropriate method of controlling the disease. And that's what we'll be seeing. That's what we'll be doing in both of those trials. So our protocol in phase 1 does allow for capturing data with withdrawal of C5 inhibitors, but we have the information we need to proceed with that in the pivotal trials.
Got it. As you alluded to, 9930 has shown strong effects on hemoglobin and transfusion, stronger effects on those parameters versus on LDH. Can you talk about your regulatory feedback on this front and just the importance of outcomes and patient level measures to the agency in the field relative to biomarkers, maybe older biomarkers like LDH? And I guess what are the other key secondary endpoints of the phase 3 that are going to be important beyond the hemoglobin primary?
Yeah, I would actually start with that point on LDH. It is a biomarker. It's an older biomarker. It's been a surrogate endpoint. It's not a clinical measure. The clinical measures are the ones that matter when you're achieving disease control. And so a change from baseline in hemoglobin is a clinical measure. Transfusions are a clinical measure. We're seeing strong differences in both of those in our data. And those are then our primary endpoints. And that, in terms of feedback from the agency, we have clear alignment with the agency that those are the appropriate measures for proximal inhibition. They're the appropriate measures for clinical control. And so I think there's really no question around that. We will be assessing secondary endpoints, and we'll be looking at biomarkers like LDH amongst our secondary endpoints. Based on the data that we've seen in our phase 1, we're very confident on our ability to hit the primary in pivotal trials.
I think another thing too, Brian, is payers are going to be interested in transfusions and the lack thereof, and so that'll be an important piece in discussions on pricing and the like when we get approval.
Got it. What's your level of confidence in your ability to enroll a treatment-naive PNH study? How challenging might that be, and what are some of the strategies that you can take, things like global sites or whatnot, that can enroll a study rapidly and with a patient population that could be adequate to the FDA to facilitate U.S. approval?
So we're confident, first of all, and these will be global trials. So we have access to patients around the globe. We've also successfully enrolled in our phase 1 during a global pandemic. And so to us, I think we're really quite confident in our ability to do this going forward in both populations. And so really, something that we're quite happy with.
I'd add too, in the HAE program with Orladeyo, we had sites all around the world for our APEX-S study. So it's not like this is new to us.
Great. Can you touch on any other areas beyond PNH that you're interested in pursuing with 9930? What are your latest thoughts on other indications it could be leverageable for, and what are you most excited about prioritizing?
So this is a really exciting area for us. We have a effective factor D inhibitor that we're taking into trials in pivotal trials in PNH. It is, as a result, something that we will then look at is for proximal inhibition in other alternative pathway diseases. We talked about a renal path and proof of concept in renal diseases, and so select complement-mediated nephritis indications are an appropriate place to go. There are other diseases where the alternative pathway is critical to the biology and to the clinical outcomes in the disease, and so I think there's several places we can also look following that. And I think one thing you'll see with us is taking an oral monotherapy into treatment for the alternative pathway is something that gives us a potentially a very wide reach with this drug. So more to come.
Good. Look forward to that. And maybe just in the last couple of minutes we have remaining, on the 9250 ALK2 program, where do you guys stand now with respect to some of the ongoing non-clinical work there in terms of chronic tox, manufacturing, et cetera? And what are the key factors, gating factors for phase 2 initiation?
So we are progressing and making progress. So we have non-clinical and tox work to do and manufacturing to do to advance to phase 2. That will take most of the year to complete, and we're proceeding with that. And I think we'll proceed from there into phase 2 trials, and we'll update later in the year. I don't know, John, if you want to add anything else on that.
Yeah, listen, this is a high unmet medical need, right? And there was a period of time where it looked pretty crowded, that there were going to be a lot of drugs that were going to come to the market, and then a bunch of them didn't make it, right? And so, we didn't invest in parallel like we did with 9930 in complement-mediated diseases, where we're running tox and drug supply manufacturing in parallel. So now we're playing catch up. But from our perspective right now, there's still a huge unmet need for patients with FOP, and we're going to move that as quickly as we can, but we got some catch up to do.
Understood. And any comments on sort of how when that does move into phase 2, how you envision that clinical development program?
I think at this point it's hard to predict. I mean, this is a disease, the earlier you catch people, right, kids, the better. But in all drug development, you can't start there. And so, we'll have discussions with regulators, and just like we have with every other program, and figure out what the best path forward is.
That makes sense. Well, great. I know we covered a lot. Unfortunately, we're just about out of time. So John and team, thank you guys so much for presenting and being a part of this, and look forward to talking again soon. Thanks to the audience for listening.
Thanks, Brian.